Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a pig has destroyed your potato garden. Obviously, you have two options. You could chase the pig away, or you could accidentally create a military crisis between two global superpowers. And somehow, in 1859, one American settler chose option number two. Because after an American man shot a pig on an island in the Pacific Northwest, the United States and Great Britain ended up sending soldiers, warships, artillery, and hundreds of troops to the same tiny island, and somehow, nobody actually fought. The only confirmed casualty was the pig. But the weirdest part isn't even the pig, because this wasn't really a story about a pig. It was a story about a border that nobody could agree on, two governments that were already suspicious of each other, and a bunch of local officials who apparently looked at a minor dispute and thought, yeah, let's add the military. So let's go back to 1859. The island was San Juan Island, located between what is now Washington State and British Columbia. And at this point, the United States and Great Britain had a problem. They couldn't agree on who actually owned it. A few years earlier, in 1846, the two countries had signed the Oregon Treaty, which established part of their boundary along the 49th parallel. Sounds simple, except the treaty said the boundary should follow the middle of the channel separating the mainland from Vancouver Island. And there was one tiny problem. There were two channels. The British preferred one, the Americans preferred the other, and sitting between them were the San Juan Islands. So basically, Britain looked at the map and said, that's ours. America looked at the exact same map and said, no, that's ours. And neither side was particularly interested in leaving. By the 1850s, the British Hudson's Bay Company had established a massive sheep farm on San Juan Island. By 1859, the farm had thousands of sheep roaming around the island. Meanwhile, American settlers were also moving onto the island and claiming land for themselves. The Americans believed they had every right to be there. The British considered many of them illegal squatters. So you've got two groups of people living on the same disputed piece of land under two different governments, with neither government willing to admit that the other one owns it. This is basically a geopolitical powder keg. It just needed something stupid to light it. And unfortunately, there was a pig. On June 15, 1859, an American settler named Lyman Cutlar woke up and discovered that one of the Hudson's Bay Company's pigs had gotten into his garden. And this wasn't apparently the first time. The pig had developed a habit of wandering onto Cutlar's property and destroying his crops, which, to be fair, if you've ever tried growing anything, you know how annoying that is. Except Cutlar wasn't dealing with a random neighborhood pig. This pig belonged to a giant British company on an island that Britain and America were already fighting over. So when Cutlar found the pig rooting around in his potato patch, he grabbed his gun and shot it. The pig died. And that's where things get ridiculous. Cutlar apparently regretted killing the animal and offered to pay the Hudson's Bay Company for it. Which would seem like the end of the story. You killed the pig, you pay for the pig, everybody goes home. But the Hudson's Bay Company manager Charles Griffin wasn't interested in simply accepting payment. Instead, the dispute turned into an argument over whether Cutlar and the other Americans even had the right to be on the island. British authorities threatened to arrest Cutlar and remove American settlers as trespassers. And suddenly, we aren't talking about a pig anymore. We're talking about sovereignty. And that was a much bigger problem. The American settlers were understandably not thrilled about the possibility of being arrested and removed from the island, so they appealed to the American military commander in the region, Brigadier General William Harney, and Harney made a decision. He would send American troops to San Juan Island. On July 27th, Captain George E. Pickett arrived with a company of the 9th U.S. Infantry. There were only around 64 men. That's it. A small group of American soldiers had just landed on disputed territory claimed by Britain. And Pickett wasn't planning on leaving. Now you might be thinking, okay, Britain probably wasn't going to start a war over one pig. Correct, but Britain wasn't particularly happy about the Americans landing troops on territory Britain claimed. So the British response was warships. A British Royal Navy steam frigate called HMS Tribune, carrying 31 guns, sailed into Griffin Bay, and then two more British warships arrived. Suddenly, this tiny island had an American military force on one side and British warships sitting offshore on the other. And this is where the story gets increasingly absurd, because the Americans weren't just sitting around. They started bringing in reinforcements and building fortifications. By the end of August, approximately 461 American troops were encamped on the island with 14 field cannons. They even positioned additional heavy naval guns. Meanwhile, the British had an enormous advantage at sea, with dozens of guns and thousands of Royal Marines available around the area. So imagine standing on San Juan Island in 1859, you look one direction, American soldiers, you look the other direction, British warships, and somewhere in the middle, there is a dead pig. This had somehow become an international military crisis. But here's the fascinating part. The British had the ability to seriously overwhelm the American force, but the British naval commander, Rear Admiral Lambert Baines, refused to turn the situation into a war. According to the National Park Service, Baines was essentially unwilling to involve Britain and the United States in a war over what he regarded as a dispute about a pig. And honestly, thank God somebody in this story had common sense, because local officials on both sides were getting increasingly aggressive. But the people actually capable of starting a war realized something very important. This was stupid. The problem was that nobody wanted to back down first, because backing down could look like admitting the other country owned the island, and neither government wanted to do that. So instead, they waited, and waited, and waited. The situation became so strange that the soldiers weren't exactly behaving like enemies. American and British officers interacted socially. They attended church services together, they shared drinks and cigars, and tourists visiting from nearby Victoria apparently even came to watch the military standoff. Think about that. You've got British warships preparing for a possible confrontation with American troops, and people are basically showing up like, honey, pack the picnic basket, we're going to go watch the international crisis. The two sides were technically facing each other, but nobody really wanted to pull the trigger, because everyone understood that the moment somebody fired a shot, this could become much bigger than San Juan Island. A local dispute could turn into a war between Britain and the United States. And in 1859, that was not something either side wanted. Eventually, news reached officials in Washington, and they were understandably concerned, because from their perspective, this wasn't some weird little island standoff anymore. It looked like American and British forces were preparing for a potential armed confrontation. President James Buchanan sent General Winfield Scott, one of the most senior American military commanders, to try to calm things down, and Scott had experience dealing with tense disputes between Britain and America. He arrived in the region in October 1859 and began negotiations. And finally, someone pressed the giant geopolitical emergency brake. The solution was surprisingly simple. Neither side would completely give up its claim. Instead, Britain and the United States agreed to jointly occupy San Juan Island until they could figure out who actually owned it. American forces would remain on one side, British forces would establish their own camp on the other, and the two countries would basically share the island while arguing about who owned it. The crisis was over, sort of, because the island remained under joint British-American military occupation for 12 years. Yes, the pig died in June 1859, and the United States and Britain were still sorting out the consequences more than a decade later. In March 1860, British Royal Marines established what became known as English Camp on the island. The Americans had their own camp. So for years, San Juan Island basically contained two miniature military communities representing two different countries. And despite the bizarre circumstances, relations between many of the soldiers were surprisingly peaceful. This wasn't a battlefield. It was more like an extremely awkward neighborhood, where both neighbors had guns and neither wanted to admit they were neighbors. And this arrangement continued through the American Civil War, through major political changes, through years of negotiations, and through more than a decade of uncertainty. Until finally, in 1871, Britain and the United States agreed to submit the San Juan boundary dispute to arbitration. And the person chosen to settle it was Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. Yes, after Britain and America spent years arguing over an island, they eventually asked the German emperor to decide who got it. He referred the matter to a three-person arbitration commission in Geneva, and on October 21, 1872, the decision came down. The boundary would run through the Haro Strait, which meant the San Juan Islands belonged to the United States. The British finally withdrew their Royal Marines from English Camp on November 25, 1872. The remaining American troops eventually left in 1874. After 12 years of joint military occupation, the dispute was finally over. And what had started the entire chain of events? A pig. But technically, the pig wasn't the real reason. The real problem was that Britain and America had never properly agreed on where the border went. The pig simply happened to wander into the middle of that mess. Which means if you ever find yourself arguing with someone over something incredibly stupid, just remember, history has already proven that stupid arguments can get surprisingly expensive. Because one farmer wanted his potatoes protected. One pig apparently wanted those potatoes too. One government wanted to protect its citizens. Another government wanted to protect its territorial claims. A few military commanders decided to bring in troops. Then Britain brought in warships. America built fortifications. And somehow, after all of that, nobody fired a shot. The only casualty of the entire war was the pig. And even the National Park Service admits there's one question about this story that people keep asking: who ate the pig? And unfortunately, we don't know. Which means after years of international tension, military occupation, diplomacy, and arbitration, we still don't have the most important answer: who got the bacon?